read reports of Kevin McCarthy and the president having basically a swearing conversation. That's when the swearing commenced, because the president was basically saying, I'm okay with this.
Leader McCarthy, the President of the United States has a briefing room steps from the Oval Office. The cameras are hot 24/7, as you know. Why hasn't he walked down and said that now?
I conveyed to the president what I think is best to do, and I'm hopeful the president will do it.
And have you spoken with his chief of staff?
I've spoken to the president. I've spoken to other people in there and to the White House as well.
Who else reached out to Ms. Trump that you know of that afternoon about the attack on the Capitol?
I believe at one point McCarthy did.
I heard my phone ringing, turned the shower off, saw it was Leader McCarthy, who I had a good relationship with. He told me it was getting really ugly over at the Capitol and said, please, anything you could do to help, I would appreciate it. I don't recall specific asks, just anything you could do. Again, I got the sense that, they were scared.
They, meaning Leader McCarthy and people on the Hill.
He's having a shower.
He was scared, yes.
Think about that.
At
Leader
1:15.
McCarthy, who was one of the president's strongest supporters, was scared and begging for help. President Trump turned him down. So he tried to call the president's children. Republican House member Mike Gallagher also implored the president to call off the attack.
Mr. President, you have got to stop this. You are the only person who can call this off. Call it off. The election is over. Call it off.
President-elect Joe Biden also went live on TV to demand that President Trump tell the mob to leave.
I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
There was a desperate scramble for everyone to get President Trump to do anything. All this occurred, and the president still did not act. I yield to my friend from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. President Trump finally relented to the pleas from his staff, his family, and from Capitol Hill for him to do something more at 4:17, 187 minutes, more than 3 hours after he stopped speaking at the Ellipse, after he stopped speaking to a mob that he had sent armed to the Capitol. That's when he tweeted a video telling the rioters to go home, while also telling them that they were special and that he loved them. By that time, although, the violence was far from over. Law enforcement had started to turn the tide, reinforcements were on the way, and elected officials were in secure locations. The writing was already on the wall. The rioters would not succeed. Here's what was showing on Fox News, the channel the president was watching all afternoon.
Yeah, what's showing on Fox?
Back to Brett Baer with more information now. Brett, what do you have?
Yeah, our Pentagon team, Jen Griffin, Lucas Tomlinson, confirming the Defense Department has now mobilized the entire D.C. National Guard, 1,800 troops. Takes several hours, as I mentioned before, to get them up and running. The Army Secretary Ron McCarthy is setting up a headquarters at the FBI. You just heard from David Spunt that the FBI is also sending troops to the Capitol.
And the National Guard were massed on Maryland border.
Then, the President Trump finally gave in and went out to the Rose Garden at 4:03. His staff had prepared a script for him to read, but he refused to use it. As you can see on the screen, you can see the script is stamped "President has seen." The script said, quote, "I'm asking you to leave the Capital Region now and go home in a peaceful way." The president was urged to stick to this script, but he spoke off the cuff. Eric Hirschman and Nick Luna went with the president to film the message in the Rose Garden. Let's hear what they had to say.
Oh, are we going to see the draft?
Raw footage.
Oh, the never before seen.
This video.
Oh, this is special.
Ultimately, these remarks that we're looking at here in Exhibit 25 were not the remarks that the president delivered in the Rose Garden. Do you know why the president decided not to
use these?
I don't know, sir. No, I do not know why.
Did the president use any written remarks to your knowledge, or did he just go off the cuff?
To my knowledge, it was off the cuff, sir.
Good, Chase. When you're ready, sir.
Goodness.
You tell me when you're ready, sir. Who's behind me? He's gone around. We're all clear now. I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had a election. Let me see. I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election.
Oh, we're such
But
victims.
we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
When I got there, basically the president just had finished filming the video, and I think he was basically retiring for the day.
Was there any discussion about the president releasing a second video that day?
Not that I recall. When he finished his video, I think everyone was like, day's over. People were pretty drained.
Were pretty what?
Drained.
But we say day over, there were still people in the Capitol at that point, weren't there?
There were people in the Capitol, but I believe by this stage, law enforcement, and I'd have to go back and look, but I believe law enforcement was either there or moving in or going to take charge.
I guess
I
Trump
think
knew
just
he'd
that
lost.
People were emotionally drained by the time that videotape was done.
Emotionally drained at the White House? Here's what was happening at the same time at the Capitol. We warned the audience that this clip also contains strong language and violence.
Hey, keep pushing. Don't lose the momentum. Another officer unconscious. The terrorist. What terrorist?
Everybody, we need gas masks. We need weapons. We need strong, angry patriots to help our boys. They don't want to leave.
While President Trump refused to even lift another finger to help, other leaders honored their oaths and acted to clear the Capitol and resume the joint session. For instance, here are never-before-seen photos and video of congressional leaders in action during the attack. The video is a portion of a call they had at approximately 4:45 with Acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller.
We're not going to let these people keep us from finishing our business. So we need you to get the building cleared, give us the okay so we can go back in session and finish up the people's business as soon as possible.
Mr. Secretary and Senator Schumer, some people here in the Capitol Police believe it would take us several days to secure the building. Do you agree with that analysis?
I'm not on the ground, but I do not agree with that analysis.
So what is the earliest that we could safely resume our proceedings in the Senate and House chambers? The earliest we could safely resume?
I
The Vice President also worked the phones from his own secure evacuation location,
In the
including
basement.
conversations with Acting Secretary of Defense Miller and other military leaders, well past President Trump's 417 video. Let's look at some never-before-seen photographs of the Vice President during this critical time.
Oh my
And
gosh.
hear about the Vice President's conversation with military leaders to secure the Capitol and ensure
They were,
everyone was safe.
they're essentially acting like the 25th Amendment.
Vice President Pence, there were 2 or 3 calls with Vice President Pence. He was very animated, and he issued very explicit,
He's in a garage. He's in the basement garage.
very direct, unambiguous orders. There was no question about that. And he was, and I can get you the exact quotes, I guess, from some of our records somewhere, but he was very animated, very direct, very firm, and to Secretary Miller.
He's essentially
Get the
acting
military
president.
down here, get the guard down here, put down this situation, etc.
As you heard earlier in the hearing, the President did not call the Vice President or anyone in the military, federal law enforcement, or DC government. Not a single person. But General Milley did hear from Mark Meadows. The contrast between that call and his calls with Vice President Pence tell you everything you need to know about President Trump's dereliction of duty. Let's listen.
Let's listen.
He said, this is from memory. He said, we have to kill the narrative that the Vice President is making all the decisions. We need to establish the narrative that that the president is still in charge. And that
A false narrative.
things are steady or stable or words that way. I immediately interpret that as politics, politics, politics. Red flag for me personally, no action, but I remember it distinctly. And I don't do political narratives.
So while President Trump and his advisors were drained, other leaders upheld their oaths to do the right thing. Maybe it was exhausting to get the president to put out that video, but think about the law enforcement officers who were attacked by the mob that day. President Trump had summoned them himself to Washington. And what about President Trump? He watched TV, tweeted, called senators to try to delay the count of electoral votes, called Rudy Giuliani, and argued with his staff who were insisting that he should call off the attack. Ms. Matthews, what was your reaction to President Trump's message to the mob at 417?
I was struck by the fact that he chose to begin the video by pushing the lie that there was a stolen election. And as the video went on, I felt a small sense of relief because he finally told these people to go home. But that was immediately followed up by him saying, "We love you, you're very special." And that was disturbing to me because he didn't distinguish between those that peacefully attended his speech earlier that day and those that we watched cause violence at the Capitol. Instead, he told the people who we had just watched storm our nation's Capitol with the intent on overthrowing our democracy, violently attack police officers, and chant heinous things like "Hang Mike Pence, we love you, you're very special." And as a spokesperson for him, I knew that I would be asked to defend that. And to me, his refusal to act and call off the mob that day and his refusal to condemn the violence was indefensible. And so I knew that I would be resigning that evening. And so I finished out the workday, went home and called my loved ones to tell them of my decision and resigned that evening.
Thank you. Indefensible.
There's probably a lot of Trump
Let's see what
things
some of your
that
colleagues
you
in
have
the
to
press
defend
office
that are
told us about their
indefensible. but-
reaction to the same 417 message.
I felt like it was the absolute bare minimum of what could have been said at that point for something on camera.
Yes.
What else do you think should have been said? So a more forceful
Denunciation.
dismissal of the violence, a more forceful command to go home, a more forceful respect for law enforcement, even a comparison to the respect that we have given law enforcement as it relates to what was done to them in the prior summer. And I thought it was important that an acknowledgement be given to the U.S. Capitol building itself, what it's a symbol of, what it means, not only to the people that work there, but to the American people generally, and the work of Congress that by law needed to be conducted that day.
It did, and the plan
Do you
was to
wish, in
disrupt
hindsight,
it.
that the president had asked the protesters to leave the Capitol earlier than he ended up asking them to do that?
Of course, I would love if the go home message would have happened earlier in the day.
The president's words matter. We know that many of the rioters were listening to President Trump. We heard from one last week, Stephen Ayers. Let's listen to what he had to say about the 417 message from the president and see how rioters reacted to the president's message in real time.
Well, when we were there, as soon as that come out, everybody started talking
Good. I was
about
hoping
it.
they'd replay this.
It seemed like it started to disperse, some of the crowd.
I'm here delivering the president's message. Donald Trump has asked everybody to go home.
That's our order. They were taking orders from the president.
Go home. He says go home. Yeah, he said to go home.
That's very powerful.
But just as Mr. Ayers said, police were still fending off the last throes of the brutal assault. I yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Trump
While
used
everyone
Twitter to give
else was
instructions to a
working to get
an
Congress
army.
back in session, what did President Trump do? At 6:01, just 1 minute after the citywide curfew went into effect, he posted his last tweet of the day.
Oh.
After officers engaged in multiple hours of hand-to-hand combat, with over 100 of them sustaining injuries,
140.
President Trump tweeted at 6:01 and justified the violence as a natural response to the election. He said, quote, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide victory is so unceremoniously, viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly, unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and peace. Remember this day forever." He called the mob great patriots. He told people to remember the day forever. He showed absolutely no remorse. A few minutes later, at 6:27, the president left the dining room and he went up to the White House residence for the night. On the screen is the last photograph of the president that night as he went into the residence. As he was gathering his things in the dining room to leave, President Trump reflected on the day's events with a White House employee. This was the same employee who had met President Trump in the Oval Office after he returned from the ellipse. President Trump said nothing to the employee about the attack. He said only, quote, "Mike Pence let me down." Ms. Matthews, what was your reaction to President Trump's 6:01 tweet?
At that point, I had already made the decision to resign, and this tweet just further cemented my decision. I thought that January 6, 2021 was one of the darkest days in our nation's history, and President Trump was treating it as a celebratory occasion with that tweet. And so it just further cemented my decision to resign.
Others agreed with your assessment of that tweet. Let's look at what they had to say.
Yep.
Who asked you about this tweet before it was sent?
The president.
Tell us about that conversation and everything that you said and he said to the best of your recollection.
Sure. So he said, "What do you think of this?" And I believe I saw the text message or on his phone. And I remember saying to him, the wording on the first sentence, I guess it's one long sentence, but the wording on the first sentence would lead some to believe that potentially he had something to do with the events that happened at the Capitol.
What did he say?
I don't recall him saying anything in response to that. I believe that was the end of the conversation.
Did he change anything in light of your comments?
No, sir, he did not.
And what about this made you think that someone might perceive the president having a role in the violence at the Capitol?
It was my interpretation of the words. I mean, I'm not I don't write speeches or anything, but the phrase, "these are the things that happened," to me sounded as if culpability was associated with it, to me.
I don't think it's a patriotic act to attack the Capitol, but I have no idea how to characterize the people other than they trespassed, destroyed property, and assaulted the U.S. Capitol.
And hurt
calling them patriots.
law enforcement officers, 140.
Let's say a stretch, to say the least.
Some of whom can no
Is that all it
longer.
is, a stretch, or just flatly wrong?
I don't think it's a patriotic act to attack the U.S. Capitol.
Would you call it unpatriotic?
Criminal, unpatriotic, sure.
What happened at the Capitol cannot be justified in any form or fashion. It was wrong and it was tragic and
And it was a product of lies.
it was a terrible day. It was a terrible day for this country.
And the people who enabled
thought it was
a liar as the
inappropriate.
president are
Why?
responsible in part for what happened.
To my mind, it was a day that should be remembered in infamy. That
Yes.
wasn't the tenet of this tweet.
Despite the violence of the day, the effort
Infamy.
to delay the certification continued. That evening, Rudy Giuliani called several of President Trump's closest political allies in the hour before the joint session resumed. Representative Jim Jordan and Senators Marsha Blackburn, Tommy Tuberville, Bill Hagerty, Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley, and Ted Cruz. We know why Mr. Giuliani was calling them because at 7:02, he left a voicemail for Senator Tuberville, which later became public. Let's listen to just the start of it.
Senator Tuberville, or I should say Coach Tuberville, this is Rudy Giuliani, President's lawyer. I'm calling you because I want to discuss with you how they're trying to rush this hearing and how we need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you.
In furtherance of our coup.
Mr. Giuliani did not even mention the attack on the Capitol. Instead, he was pushing on behalf of President Trump to get members of Congress to further delay the certification.
Yes.
Even though some members did proceed with objections, Vice President Pence and Congress stood firm and successfully concluded the joint session in the early morning hours of January 7th. Here are some of what members of the president's party said in the days and weeks after the attack.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically
And morally?
and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
And failing to stop
No
them.
question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions
Yes.
of their president.
Yes.
And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence
Of having a liar as a
of the
president
growing
supported by Republicans.
crescendo of false statements,
Yes.
conspiracy theories,
Yes.
and reckless hyperbole,
Reckless
which the
hyperbole.
defeated
Indeed.
president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth.
His Twitter account.
The violence,
What?
destruction, and chaos we saw earlier was unacceptable, undemocratic, and un-American.
Yeah.
It was the saddest day I've ever had as serving as a member of this institution.
Madam Speaker, today the People's House was attacked, which is an attack on the Republic itself. There is no excuse for it. A woman died, and people need to go to jail. And the president should never have spun up certain Americans to believe something that simply cannot be.
Well, after 3 a.m, Congress certified the 2020 election results. Soon after, this statement by President Trump was posted on Dan Scavino's Twitter account because the president's account by now had been suspended.
Woohoo.
As you can see, President
lost.
Trump stuck with his big lie that the election was stolen. But he did say there would be an orderly transition. We learned, though, that the statement was not necessarily his idea. Jason Miller, a campaign advisor, told us that after the joint session started, he heard nothing from President Trump or the White House about assuring the nation that the transfer of power would take place. So Mr. Miller took it upon himself to draft the statement and call the president at 9:23 that night to convince him to put it out. Let's listen to what he had to say about the call.
Did he disagree with something that you had put in the statement, some particular word or phrase that he did not want included?
Orderly transition.
I'd say just he wanted to say peaceful transition. And
Really?
I said that ship's kind of already sailed, so we're going to say orderly transition. That was about the extent of disagreement or pushback from the conversation.
I bet it wasn't.
The last person President Trump spoke to by phone that night was Johnny McEntee, his head of personnel. Mr. McEntee told us that they talked about the events of the day and the multiple resignation by administration officials. The decision whether to resign was one that weighed heavily on people in the administration. On the one hand, people like Mr. Pottinger and Ms. Matthews here, as proud as they were to have served, refused to be associated with President Trump's dereliction of duty. But others were sincerely worried that leaving President Trump to his own devices would put the country at continued risk.
That was scary.
Listen to what we heard about that tension from Pat Cipollone, from General Mark Milley, and Eugene Scalia, who was the Secretary of Labor.
And then after that, some people were resigning, obviously, over January 6th. We know who they were. Did I consider it? Yes. Did I do it? No.
He wanted to be an adult in the room.
People in the counsel's office left. Who would replace me?
Rudy Giuliani,
And I
Sidney
had
Powell.
some concerns that it might be somebody who, had been giving bad advice.
Michael
On the
Flynn.
morning of the 7th, the decision I arrived at was that the most constructive thing I could think of was to seek a meeting of the cabinet.
For the 25th Amendment?
Thought that trying to work within the administration to steady the ship was likely to have greater value than simply resigning. After which point I would have been powerless to really affect things within the administration.
Gene thought that there should be a cabinet meeting.
Do you know why Mark would not?
I don't remember why. I think it probably had something to do with Mark's view of how the president might react and that he, things like that.
Now, there was a couple of calls where, Meadows and or Pompeo, but more Meadows, how's the president doing? Like Pompeo might say, how's the president doing? And Meadows would say, well, he's in a really dark place. Like here's one, for example,
The country was also in a
On the
middle of a
7th.
pandemic, by the way.
of January. So this is day after, right?
And Trump is consumed
Opponents
with
is
his
very
own loss.
emotional and in a bad place. Meadows.
As you heard, Secretary Scalia
Very
wanted
emotional.
President Trump to convene a cabinet meeting. He put his request in a memo to the president, and here's what it said. You can see that Secretary Scalia recommended that the president, quote, no longer publicly question the election results after Wednesday. No one can deny this is harmful. Secretary Scalia also highlighted the importance of the public knowing the president would invoke his cabinet in decision-making and not, quote, certain private individuals. Though Secretary Scalia did not say it, he was referring to Rudy Giuliani and the rest of the
And Sidney
so-called
Powell.
clown car working with President Trump to try to overturn the election. Secretary Scalia understood that the president needed to do more to reassure the public about the last few weeks of the Trump administration. Mr. Pottinger, when you made the decision to resign, did you walk out of the White House immediately?
No, I wanted to first talk to my immediate boss, that was the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. Robert O'Brien was traveling on the 6th. I reached him at about 4:30 p.m. And told him that I was submitting my resignation. He accepted the resignation, but he also asked whether I could stay until he could get back to the White House. And I agreed to that. We both wanted to make sure that I was leaving in a responsible way. We still have foreign adversaries to worry about, hackers, terrorists, nation states. I did not want to leave my chair empty, given that I was the top national security staffer in the White House. So I ended up staying at my desk through the night. When Robert O'Brien arrived back at the White House the next morning, the morning of the 7th, I debriefed with him and left for the last time.
So you and I both share a passion for national security of our country. Can you share with me, what's your view on how January 6th impacted our national security?
Well, when you have a presidential transition, even under the best circumstances, it's a time of vulnerability. It's a time of vulnerability. And when you have a contested election, I was certainly concerned that some of our adversaries would be tempted to probe or test U.S. resolve. As an example, in late December, the Iranian government attacked the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. They did that using some of their terrorist proxies. President Trump did handle that. He sent a very clear warning to the Ayatollah and his regime, which I think had a useful effect. I think that we would have handled other threats of that nature, and luckily no other threats materialized before the inauguration on the 20th. But our national security was harmed in a different way by the 6th of January, and that is that it, I think it emboldened our enemies by helping give them ammunition to feed a narrative that our system of government doesn't work, that the United States is in decline. China, the Putin regime in Russia, Tehran, they're fond of pushing those kinds of narratives. And by the way, they're wrong. We've been hearing for the entirety of U.S. history from kings and despots that the United States is in decline, and those kings and despots have been proven wrong every single time. But nonetheless, January 6th helped feed a perception that I think emboldens our adversaries. The other part I think is simply our allies. I heard from a lot of friends in Europe, in Asia, allies, close friends, and supporters of the United States that they were concerned about the health of our democracy. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to put their minds at ease, to put our own hearts at ease by investigating what happened on the 6th and making sure that it never happens again.
Look, I've always said democracies are not defined by bad days. They're defined by how they recover from those bad days. And that's what we're doing here, is to bring accountability to that so we can actually come back even stronger than when we went into January 6th. Ms. Matthews, as you left the White House for the last time that night, January 6th, what did you think Americans needed to hear from President Trump?
I think that the American people needed to hear and see him publicly commit to a peaceful or at least orderly transition of power. In the aftermath of the Capitol attack, it wasn't just enough for us to ask him to condemn the violence. He needed to agree that he would peacefully transfer power over to the incoming administration, because that's one of our fundamentals and what it means to live in a democracy. And so that evening when I resigned, the resignation statement that I drafted, I referenced this and I said, our nation needs a peaceful transfer of power, in hopes that it would put some sort of public pressure on the White House and President Trump to publicly agree to an orderly transition.
Thank you. I yield to my friend from Virginia.
She's making her friend Kayleigh McEnany look bad for not doing the same thing.
The staff who remained at the White House on the morning of January 7th knew the president needed to address the nation again, and they had a speech prepared for him that morning, but he refused for hours to give it. As you heard Cassidy Hutchins testify previously, President Trump finally agreed to record an address to the nation later that evening, the evening of January 7th, because of concerns he might be removed from power under the 25th Amendment or by impeachment. We know these threats were real. Sean Hannity said so himself in a text message that day to Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. He wrote, "No more stolen election talk. Yes, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real." We obtained the never-before-seen raw footage of the president recording his address to the nation that day on January 7th, more than 24 hours after the last time he had addressed the nation from the Rose Garden. Let's take a look.
Whenever you're ready, sir.
So glad he's not in office anymore at the moment.
I would like to begin by
44%
addressing the
of-
heinous attack yesterday.
Heinous.
And to those who broke the law, you will pay. You do not represent our movement. You do not represent our country. And if you broke the law, I already said you will pay. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defied the seat of justice. It's defiled, right? See, I can't see it very well. Okay, I'll do this. I'm going to do this. Let's go. But this election is now over. Congress has certified the results. I don't want to say the election's over. I just want to say Congress has certified the results without saying the election's over.
This is powerful. He looks like a big baby.
Yeah, right. I didn't say over, so let me see. Don't go to the paragraph before.
Which is weak. This is very good at undermining an element of fascism, which is strongman posturing.
Okay.
This is so important. I hope people
I
isolate
would
this.
like to begin by addressing the heinous attack yesterday. Yesterday is a hard word for me.
This is fantastic.
Good. Take the word yesterday because it doesn't work with you.
I'm going to video.
The heinous attack on our country. Say on our country. Want to say that? No. My only goal was to ensure the integrity of the vote. My only goal was to ensure the integrity of the vote.
That
On
was
January
power
7th,
kegels.
one day after
swaying
he incited an
independence.
insurrection based on a lie, President Trump still could not say that the election was over.
Because he's a big petulant fascist
Mr.
baby.
Pottinger, you've taken
Don't
the
forget
oath
the fascist.
multiple times in the
I don't let him
Marines
talk
and
again.
as an official in the
He's awful.
executive branch. Can you please share with us your view about the oath of office and how that translates into accepting election results and a transfer of power?
But all right, he's a man and men will listen to him.
Sure. You know, this isn't the first time that we've had a close election in this country. And President Trump certainly had every right to challenge in court the results of these various elections.
On such spurious grounds that the
But
lawyers have
once
been
you've had due
disbarred.
process under the law,
Their licenses
you
revoked.
have to conform with the law, no matter how bitter the result. Once you've presented your evidence in court, judges have heard that evidence, judges have ruled.
64 cases were
If you continue to contest an election, you're not just contesting an election anymore. You're actually challenging the Constitution itself. You are challenging the societal norms that allow us to remain unified.
Yes, this is true.
I think that one example, for example, you've got Vice President Richard Nixon back in 1960 had lost a hard-fought election against Senator John F. Kennedy.
This dude is so pompous.
There were irregularities in that vote, according to a lot of the histories, and a lot of Vice President Nixon's supporters asked him to fight, contest it, don't concede. But in one of his finest moments, Vice President Nixon said no. He said it would tear the country to pieces, and he conceded to Jack Kennedy and announced that he was going to support him as the next president. We have an example of a Democratic candidate for president, Vice President Al Gore, who faced a very similar dilemma.
Shouldn't have
He
conceded the Supreme
strongly
Court.
disagreed with the Supreme Court decision.
Was stuffed with
that,
Kavanaugh, Amy Coney
lost
Barrett.
his
not the Supreme
election
Court.
bid and allowed President George W. Bush to take office. But he gave a speech of concession in late December, mid or late December of 2000, where he said, this is for the sake of the unity of us as a people and for the strength of our democracy. I also am going to concede. I'm going to support the new president. His speech is actually a pretty good model, I think, for any candidate for any
Guy
office,
is eating up all the
up to
oxygen
and
in the
including the
room.
president, and from any party to read, particularly right now. The oath that our presidents take, it's very similar to the oath of office I took as a U.S. Marine officer and the oath I took as a White House official. It is to support and defend the Constitution. It's to protect the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution. And it is a sacred oath. It's an oath that we take before our families. We take that oath before God. I think that
Separation of church and states in the Constitution.
we have an
Stop referencing
obligation
God
to
as if
live
we all
by,
agree on the
by
same
that
way.
oath. I do still believe that we have the most ingenious system of government on earth, despite its imperfections. I don't envy countries that don't have this system that actually allows for a predictable, peaceful transfer of government every 4 to 8 years. And it's not something that we should take for granted.
Thank you.
He's so insufferable.
As we heard at the start of the hearing,
I mean, yes, a lot of his content was good in terms of saying oaths are important, but self-aggrandizing blathering. And Al Gore was the victim of once again, a confected riot. There was a Brooks Brothers riot in Florida, allegedly organic protest to protest the recounting of the ballots in Florida because it was contested, it was so close. And instead, Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida, the brother of the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, was able to take that up to the Supreme Court and get the decision that they wanted in favor of the Republican candidate. And the lawyers who worked on it included Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who have since then been rewarded by seats on that self-same Supreme Court justice bench. And that's an important historical point. And I'm not a speaker at a hearing, unlike Matthew Pottinger, who
in
is...
the immediate aftermath of January 6th, Republican leader Kevin McCarthy understood that President Trump bore responsibility for that day and should have taken immediate action to stop the violence. He was even more candid in calls with Republican colleagues. As you'll hear in a moment, recordings of some of these calls that were later published by the New York Times. The context for these calls was that a resolution had been introduced in the House calling for Vice President Pence and the cabinet to remove President Trump from power under the 25th Amendment. Let's listen.
I've had it with this guy. What he did is unacceptable. Nobody can defend that, and nobody should defend it. The only discussion I would have with him is that I think this will pass, and it would be my recommendation we should resign. That would be my take, but I don't think he would take it, but I don't know.
But let me be very clear to all of you, and I've been very clear to the president. He bears responsibilities for his words and action. No ifs, ands, or buts. I asked him personally today, does he hold responsibility for what happened? Does he feel bad about what happened? He told me he does have some responsibility for what happened. And he needs to acknowledge that.
President Trump has never publicly acknowledged his responsibility for the attack. The only time he apparently did so was in that private call with Kevin McCarthy. There's something else President Trump has never acknowledged: the names and the memories of the officers who died following the attack on the Capitol.
Yes, 4 officers
We're
took their
honored to be
lives,
joined tonight by police and first responders who bravely protected us
as well as Brian
on
Sicknick,
January 6th.
who died of a stroke following
Your character
exposure
and
to
courage
toxins.
Give us hope that democracy can and should prevail, even in the face of a violent insurrection. We on this dais can never thank you enough for what you did to protect our democracy. On January 9th, 2 of President Trump's top campaign officials texted each other about the president's glaring silence on the tragic death of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who succumbed to his injuries the night of January 7th. These campaign officials were Tim Murtaugh, Trump's director of communications, and one of his deputies, Matthew Walking. Their job was to convince people to vote for President Trump, so they knew his heart, his mind, and his voice as well as anyone. And they knew how he connects with his supporters. Here's what they had to say about their boss. Murtaugh said, "Also shitty not to have acknowledged the death of the Capitol police officer." Walking responded, "That's enraging to me. Everything he said about supporting law enforcement was a lie." To which Murtaugh replied, "You know what this is? Of course, if he acknowledged the dead cop, he'd be implicitly faulting the mob. And he won't do that because they're his people."
Yeah.
And he would also be close to acknowledging that what he lit at the rally got out of control. No way he acknowledges something that could ultimately be called his fault. No way. President Trump did not then and does not now have the character or courage to say to the American people what his own people know to be true. He is responsible for the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Thank you, and I yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Ms. Loria.
That was powerful.
Tonight's testimony and evidence is as sobering as it is straightforward. Within minutes of stepping off the ellipse stage, Donald Trump knew about the violent attack on the Capitol. From the comfort of his dining room, he watched on TV as the attack escalated. He sent tweets that inflamed and expressed support for the desire of some to literally kill Vice President Mike Pence. For 3 hours, he refused to call off the attack.
At long last, sir, have you no
Donald Trump
decency?
refused to take the urgent advice he received that day. Not from his political opponents or from the liberal media, but from his own family, his own friends, his own staff, and his own advisors. In the midst of an attack, when there was no time for politics, the people closest to Trump told him the truth. It was his supporters attacking the Capitol.
He knew that.
He alone could get through to them. So they pled for him to act, to place
He was
his
still hoping the coup plan would
above
work.
himself. Still, he refused to lead and to meet the moment to honor his oath. It was only once the vice president and the members of Congress were in secure locations and the officers defending the Capitol began to turn the tide that then President Trump engaged in the political theater of telling the mob to go home.
Yes.
And even then,
It was
he
theater.
told them all they were special,
Special and
that he
loved.
loved them.
Hmm.
Whatever your politics, whatever you think about the outcome of the election,
Yeah. This is potent
we as
stuff for
Americans
independence.
must all agree on this.
Yes.
Donald Trump's conduct on January 6th was a supreme violation of his oath of office and a complete dereliction of his duty to our nation. It is a stain
sentence.
on our history. It is a dishonor to all those who have sacrificed and died in service of our democracy. When we present our full findings, we will recommend changes to laws and policies to guard against another January 6th.
And against
The
another
reason
Trump.
that's imperative is that the forces
Or this
Donald
Donald
Trump ignited that day have not gone away.
No.
The militant, intolerant ideologies, the militias, the alienation and the disaffection, the weird fantasies and disinformation.
Yes.
They're all still out there, ready to
Yes.
go.
Yes.
That's the elephant in the room.
Yes.
But if
This is good.
January 6th has reminded us of anything, I pray it has reminded us of this. Laws are just words on paper. They mean nothing without public servants dedicated to the rule of law.
Yes.
And who are held accountable by a public that believes oaths matter more than party tribalism or the cheap thrill of scoring political points.
Or cult
We, the people,
leaders.
must demand more of our politicians and ourselves. Oaths matter. Character matters. Truth matters. If we do not renew our faith and commitment to these principles, this great experiment of ours, our shining beacon on a hill, will not endure. I yield to the gentlewoman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Throughout our hearings,
Men will
we
listen to
provided
that.
many
And women.
facts and painted a vivid picture of the events of January 6th. The violence, the human toll, both emotional and physical,
Yes.
including the tragic loss of life. The threats to our Constitution, the rule of law, and the danger to this nation, a nation we all love as Americans. In tonight's hearing, we've gone into great detail about the events inside the White House on January 6th. We've described how the President of the United States, who was bound by oath to the Constitution and by duty to ensure the laws are faithfully executed, took no action when the cornerstone of our democracy, a peaceful transition of power, was under attack. But it's more than that. Donald Trump summoned a violent mob and promised to lead that mob to the Capitol to compel those he thought would cave to that kind of pressure.
Yeah.
And when he was thwarted in his effort to lead the armed uprising, he instigated the attackers to target the vice president with violence, a man who just wanted to do his constitutional duty. So in the end, this is not, as it may appear, a story of inaction in a time of crisis, but instead it was the final action of Donald Trump's own plan to assert the will of the American people and remain in power.
Yes.
Not until it was clear that his effort to violently disrupt or delay the counting of the election results had failed did he send a message to his supporters in which he commiserated with their pain, and he told them affectionately
Commiserated.
to go home.
Commensurate means equal to,
That
but
was
anyway.
not the message of condemnation and just punishment for those who broke the law that we expect from a president whose oath and duty is to ensure the laws are faithfully executed. But instead, it was his newest version of stand back and stand by. To me, this is personal. I first swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic when I entered the U.S. Naval Academy at age 17. I spent 2 decades on ships at sea, defending our nation from known and identifiable foreign enemies who sought to do us harm. I never imagined that that enemy would come from within. I was not as prescient as Abraham Lincoln, who 23 years before the Civil War said, "If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher." Donald Trump was the author, and we, the people, for ourselves and our posterity, should not let Donald Trump be the finisher. Thank you, and I yield to the Vice Chair.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Luria. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today.
Oh, and Liz Cheney always has a
Members of the
bombshell
Select
at the
Committee
end.
may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions from our witnesses. I'd now like to turn things to Chairman Thompson for a few closing words.
The members of the committee, and I appreciate and thank all persons who've come forward voluntarily to provide information to help protect our democracy. And our work continues. As we've made clear throughout these hearings, our investigation is going forward. We continue to receive new information every day. We are pursuing many additional witnesses for testimony. We will reconvene in September to continue laying out our findings to the American people and pushing for accountability. In the first hearing of this series, I asked the American people to consider the facts and judge for themselves. The facts are clear and unambiguous. I thank the American people for their attention over the past several weeks. I wish you all a pleasant evening.
Let me again thank our witnesses today. We've seen bravery and honor in these hearings, and Ms. Matthews and Mr. Pottinger, both of you will be remembered for that, as will Cassidy Hutchinson. She sat here alone, took the oath, and testified before millions of Americans. She knew all along that she would be attacked by President Trump and by the 50, 60, and 70-year-old men who hide themselves behind executive privilege. But like our witnesses today, she has courage, and she did it anyway. Cassidy, Sarah, and our other witnesses, including Officer Caroline Edwards, Shay Moss, and her mother, Ruby Freeman, are an inspiration to American women and to American girls. We owe a debt to all of those who have and will appear here. And that brings me to another point. This committee has shown you the testimony of dozens of Republican witnesses, those who served President Trump loyally for years. The case against Donald Trump in these hearings is not made by witnesses who were his political enemies. It is instead a series of confessions by Donald Trump's own appointees, his own friends, his own campaign officials, people who worked for him for years, and his own family. They have come forward and they have told the American people the truth. And for those of you who seem to think the evidence would be different if Republican leader McCarthy had not withdrawn his nominees from this committee, let me ask you this. Do you really think Bill Barr is such a delicate flower that he would wilt under cross-examination? Pat Cipollone, Eric Hirschman, Jeff Rosen, Richard Donahue, of course they aren't. None of our witnesses are. At one point in 2016, when he was first running for office, Donald Trump said this: "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters." That quote came to mind last week when audio from Trump advisor Steve Bannon surfaced from October 31st, 2020, just a few days before the presidential election. Let's listen.
And what Trump's going to do is just declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. The Democrats, more of our people vote early that count. Theirs voted mail. And so they're going to have a natural disadvantage, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. So when you wake up Wednesday morning, it's going to be a firestorm. Also, if Trump is losing by 10 or 11 o'clock at night, it's going to be even crazier. No, because he's going to sit right there and say they stole it.
These are to Chinese donors, by the way.
Trump is going to do some crazy shit.
And of course, 4 days later, President Trump declared victory when his own campaign advisors told him he had absolutely no basis to do so. What the new Steve Bannon audio demonstrates is that Donald Trump's plan to falsely claim victory in 2020, no matter what the facts actually were, was premeditated.
Yes.
Perhaps worse, Donald Trump believed he could convince his voters to buy it, whether he had any actual evidence of fraud or not.
Yes.
And this same thing continued to occur from Election Day onward until January 6th. Donald Trump was confident that he could convince his supporters the election was stolen, no matter how many lawsuits he lost. And he lost
60.
scores of them.
60.
He was told over and over again in immense detail that the election was not stolen. There was no evidence of widespread fraud. It didn't matter. Donald Trump was confident he could persuade his supporters to believe whatever he said, no matter how outlandish, and ultimately that they could be summoned to Washington to help him remain president for another term. As we showed you last week, even President Trump's legal team, led by Rudy Giuliani, knew they had no actual evidence to demonstrate the election was stolen. Again, it didn't matter. Here's the worst part. Donald Trump knows that millions of Americans who supported him would stand up and defend our nation were it threatened. They would put their lives and their freedom at stake to protect her. And he is preying on their patriotism. He is preying on their sense of justice. And on January 6th, Donald Trump turned their love of country into a weapon against our Capitol and our Constitution. He has purposely created the false impression that America is threatened by a foreign force controlling voting machines, or that a wave of tens of millions of false ballots were secretly injected into our election system, or that ballot workers have secret thumb drives and are stealing elections with
It was a
them.
ginger mint
All complete nonsense.
that shade.
We must remember
What's hap-
that we cannot abandon the truth and remain a free nation. In late November of
Propaganda
2020,
kills.
while President Trump was still pursuing lawsuits, many of us were urging him to put any genuine evidence of fraud forward in the courts and to accept the outcome of those cases. As January 6th approached, I circulated a memo to my Republican colleagues explaining why our congressional proceedings to count electoral votes could not be used to change the outcome of the election. But what I did not know at the time was that President Trump's own advisors, also Republicans, also conservatives, including his White House counsel, his Justice Department, his campaign officials, they were all telling him almost exactly the same thing I was telling my colleagues. There was no evidence of fraud or irregularities sufficient to change the election outcome.
Yes.
Our courts had ruled. It was over. Now we know that it didn't matter what any of us said because Donald Trump wasn't looking for the right answer legally or the right answer factually. He was looking for a way to remain in office. Let's put that aside for a moment and focus just on what we saw today. In our hearing tonight, you saw an American president faced with a stark and unmistakable choice between right and wrong. There was no ambiguity, no nuance. Donald Trump made a purposeful choice to violate his oath of office, to ignore the ongoing violence against law enforcement, to threaten our constitutional order. There is no way to excuse that behavior. It was indefensible. And every American must consider this. Can a president who is willing to make the choices Donald Trump made during the violence of January 6th ever be trusted with any position of authority in our great nation again? In this room, in 1918, the Committee on Women's Suffrage convened to discuss and debate whether women should be granted the right to vote. This room is full of history, and we on this committee know we have a solemn obligation not to idly squander what so many Americans have fought and died for. Ronald Reagan's great ally, Margaret Thatcher, said this: "Let it never be said that the dedication of those who love freedom is less than the determination of those who would destroy it." Let me assure every one of you this: our committee understands the gravity of this moment, the consequences for our nation. We have much work yet to do, and we will see you all in September. I request those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted witnesses and members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Okay. Well, gracious.
So there you have it. The 8th public January 6th select hearing.
I think it's the 9th.
Bombshells. The footage of the outtakes of Donald Trump's videos of him, let's just be frank, being a whiny little baby did not
this is my
disappoint.
touch. Yeah.
I'm going to bring in Ben Meiselas, one of the hosts of Legal AF, to respond to the second half of the hearing and the video of the outtakes that we witnessed tonight.
I'm going to instead go to share just a quick extract from the hearing that I wasn't here for. Excuse the toys in the background. I'm going to share the clip of a disguised voice of a White House security official saying that amongst the staff members, there were calls to their relatives to say goodbye to family members.
A lot of very personal calls over the radio. So
It's
disturbing. I don't like talking about it, but there were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth. It was getting, for whatever the reason was on the ground, the VP detail thought that this was about to get very ugly.
And did you hear that over the radio? Okay. What was the response by the agents Secret Service agents who were there?
Everybody kept saying, at that point it was just reassurances, or I think there were discussions of reinforcements coming, but again, it was just chaos. They were just yelling.
Obviously, you conveyed this so disturbing, but what prompted you to put it into an entry, as it states there, service for the
If
Capitol?
they're running out of options and they're getting nervous, it sounds like that we came very close to either service having to use lethal options or worse. Like at that point, I don't know. Is the BP compromised? Is the detail I don't know. Like we didn't have visibility, but it doesn't. If they're screaming and saying things like say goodbye to the family, like the floor needs to know this is going to a whole nother level soon.
I'm confused about who's saying goodbye to who, so they could hear on the radio.
Personal calls over the radio, so it was disturbing. I don't like talking about it, but there were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth. It was getting, for whatever the reason was on the ground, the VP detail thought that this was about to get very ugly.
And did you hear that over the radio? Okay. What was the response by the agents Secret Service agents who were there?
Everybody kept saying, at that point it was just reassurances, or I think there were discussions of.
So I think what he's talking about is White House security officials and Secret Service agents hearing over the radio law enforcement officers calling out, knowing that the radio conversations are being recorded, and they're saying things like, tell Maggie I love her, say goodbye to, tell little Johnny, tell Molly and Sebastian I love them, so they can hear that the law enforcement officials, the Capitol police officers, the Metropolitan DC police officers who joined them in their desperate efforts to stop the mob from overrunning the Capitol, that they might die, that if they pulled out their gun and tried to use lethal weapon on the crowd, that they would be overrun by an angry mob with their own weapons of sharpened flagpole spikes, hockey sticks, bear sprays, but in some cases, some people were carrying concealed weapons at the Capitol, some of Donald Trump's mob. So thank you so much for listening to the hearing with me today. And I think that footage of Trump finding it difficult to make a video the next day, and really showing his petulance and his his desperation to cling to a narrative for his followers that no, wasn't going to concede the election, don't say the election is settled, he won, that he knew that narrative was a weapon that he could deploy, that the utter trust reposed in him by Trump supporters was something at his disposal to weaponize to his advantage in furtherance of his goal to remain in power at the expense of American democracy, at the expense of the American people at a collective level. Because even if it would have pleased Donald Trump supporters to have their candidate win, part of what Bannon said in that audio, which not all of it was played in the hearing, but Bannon says after that he wouldn't have had any more elections. If Trump was able to take office a second term, he could have more fully dispensed with the actual rigmarole of democratic elections, of holding free and fair elections. He would have been able to do more to interfere with that process, to perhaps cling to a vestige of the appearance of democratic elections, but like Putin, to stay on indefinitely as an authoritarian leader with a passionate base and a intimidated, disconcerted, apathetic, nihilistic rest of America going, what can we do? We're powerless now. Maybe they're all as bad as each other. The variety of things that people console themselves with when living under authoritarian rule. And many people will just succumb to the propaganda they hear on state-controlled media. So Trump in office in second term, Fox News would have been his ally. They would have said, no, this is fine. Everything is fine. And global markets would have responded. There would have been an outcry around the world. All the Republicans who tried to counsel Trump that this coup was too obviously a coup and wasn't going to work. Those are Republicans who have a stronger attachment than Trump to surface respectability. So they didn't want to blatantly break the law, but they did support a lawless, deceitful president in office, and they should have known better. They should have known that the fruit of that level of lying, that level of deceiving the public. And we saw an official there, a high-ranking national security official, Matthew Pottinger, lie about the great foreign policy achievements of President Trump, lie about their achievements with China. Trump started a trade war with China that impoverished a lot of American farmers. And then he threw $28 billion worth of American taxpayer money at large American farmers to help them continue to say good things about him and to hide the general affliction that he imposed on American farmers through inciting a trade war with America's trade partners, agricultural trading partners such as China and Canada and Mexico. He initiated a tariff war because that's part of the strongman's authoritarian leader's toolkit, is posturing, strength posturing, to feed into ideas about what constitutes a strong masculine leader who's strong in the face of external threats and can pick on people purely to illustrate his strength and power and the firmness, the turgidity of his resolve. Oh, that's a good expression. Turgid actually means swollen. It's often used in reference to plants. But yes, it's a good way to mock an aspiring authoritarian leader. Yes, to illustrate a strong man's turgidity of resolve, they pick fights. That is a renowned characteristic of authoritarian, despotic style leaders. All right. He picked a fight with China, and then he wanted to get a Chinese signature on a trade deal. So he kissed up to President Xi at a time that was very counterproductive to pandemic management. He spent January of 2020 talking about how great the Chinese response was to COVID, saying President Xi has this under control and everything's great. It's obviously not going to be a problem for us because this is all easily dealt with problem that China is managing. And then he got the signature from the Chinese president on January the 19th, and COVID span out of control in the United States as a consequence of Trump's dereliction of duty in that capacity as well. So that was an unmentioned backdrop to the hearing today, which is all this is going on. Trump's petulance, dedication to a coup overthrowing a democratic election result in furtherance of remaining in power, illegitimately obtaining a second term in office. There was a pandemic at peak death prior to any vaccinations, prior to widespread adoption of masking mandates. Some states were, but Trump and the Republican-dominated Congress was throwing around $800 billion at businesses that primarily did not need assistance at that time. So 75% of that $800 billion of PPP were mistargeted. Anyway, that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening today, and take care. All the best.